June 6th, 1944. 0812 hours. The Normandy coast. A German hauptmann of the 716th Static Infantry Division stands in a concrete observation post above Courseulles-sur-Mer, pronounced Courseulles-sur-Mer. Rain is blowing sideways off the channel. The bombardment has been going on since before dawn, and it has done almost nothing to the casemates. He has held this quiet stretch of the Atlantic Wall for 11 months. He knows the fields of fire, the obstacle belts, the pre-registered kill zones in front of every strong point. He has watched the first landing craft grind onto the sand. He has watched the machine guns open up, and now he is watching something he cannot explain. Canadian infantry are moving through the town below him, not pinned at the waterline, not stalled behind the wire. Moving, clearing stone houses, pushing south past the last line of fortifications, heading for open country. His garrison was supposed to hold this beach long enough for the panzer reserves to arrive and drive the invaders back into the sea. It did not hold. By nightfall, those Canadians, roughly 14,000 of them, will have driven deeper into France than any of the approximately 155,000 Allied troops who came ashore that day. Deeper than the Americans at Omaha, deeper than the Americans at Utah, deeper than the British at Gold or Sword. And they will have done it on the most heavily fortified beach assigned to any Commonwealth force, at a cost of 340 of their own. They were not supposed to get this far. This is not a story about one lucky beach. This is a story about why a country of 11.5 million people built the force that broke the Atlantic Wall wider, deeper, and more completely than anyone on either side of it thought possible. Part 1. To understand what the German High Command saw on the morning of June 6, 1944, you need to understand what they believed. And what they believed was, inside its own logic, entirely rational. The Atlantic Wall was the largest coastal fortification program in modern European history. Along the Juno sector alone, 3 battalions of Grenadier Regiment 736 manned concrete casemates, gun emplacements, and strongpoints built into the seafront villages. The garrison numbered roughly 7,700 men. They had 500 machine guns, 50 mortars, and 90 artillery pieces of various calibers. The beach itself was seeded with mined stakes, Belgian gates, and steel hedgehog obstacles designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft at high tide. Every approach was pre-registered. Every field of fire was interlocking. The 716th was a static division, no vehicles, no offensive capability. Older conscripts and Eastern European auxiliaries who had never seen combat. But the logic from Berlin was straightforward. These men did not need to be elite. They needed to be behind concrete with ammunition, covering a beach that the tide would expose for hours. A defending force behind prepared fortifications multiplies its effective combat power by a factor that makes raw numbers irrelevant. Hold the beach, delay the enemy, wait for the 21st Panzer Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division to counterattack. That was the assessment of General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th. It was the operational assumption of General Erich Marx at 84th Corps. It was the plan that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had personally inspected and reinforced. Their reasoning was not insane. It was based on the best available evidence. The problem was that the evidence was about 18 months out of date. Part 2. What broke their model was not a single weapon. It was a system, and that system had been forged in the worst day the Canadian Army ever endured. On August 19, 1942, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division attacked the French port of Dieppe in Operation Jubilee. It was a catastrophe. Of roughly 5,000 Canadians who crossed the channel that morning, over 3,300 were lost. The tanks that reached shore could not climb the shingle. The bombardment was inadequate. The infantry went in against fortified positions without specialized armor and were cut apart in the open. Here's what came out of that disaster. The engineers and the planners who survived did not repeat the lesson. They redesigned the tool. Over the next 20 months, the British 79th Armored Division under Major General Percy Hobart developed a family of specialized armored vehicles that the German coastal defenders had never encountered and had no doctrine to counter. Swimming Sherman tanks, called DD tanks, that could launch from landing craft offshore and drive onto the beach under their own power. Flail tanks, called crabs, that beat the sand with chains to detonate mines ahead of the infantry. Churchill AVRE tanks with massive petard mortars that could crack a concrete casemate at close range. The concept for the AVRE itself traced back to a Canadian, Lieutenant J.J. Denovan of the Royal Canadian Engineers, who had seen firsthand at Dieppe what happens when infantry assault a bunker with no way to crack it. At Juno, those machines landed with the first wave. At Omaha, the Americans had largely declined them. Pause on that. Company Sergeant Major Charlie Martin of the Queen's Own Rifles, who would earn the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions that morning, recalled the eerie silence of the final run-in. Then the ramp dropped. His company, A Company, sprinted 200 yards of open sand under direct fire. Men fell around him. His second-in-command was hit within seconds of reaching the beach. But the D.D. Shermans of the 1st Hussars were there. 22 of 29 had made it ashore through the heavy seas, and they engaged the casemates that were tearing the infantry apart. The commanding officer of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles credited those tanks with making the overwhelming of the defenses possible. At Courseulles, Captain Philip Gower of the Winnipegs, who had lost his helmet during the landing, stood upright on the open beach under fire, directing his surviving men forward position by position. His Military Cross citation, published in the Canada Gazette of May 1945, states that he reduced the defenses one by one through personal example. His company had lost 3/4 of its strength. He kept fighting with the 26 men he had left. Men like the Queen's Own Rifles and the Winnipegs who crossed that sand at Juno deserve to be remembered. Every like on this video keeps the story of Courseulles and Bernières, pronounced Bernières, visible for a few more people. It does not cost anything. It matters more than it should. Part 3. Here's the question that the German High Command could not answer on June 6th, and that most popular histories of D-Day still do not ask. How did a country with a pre-war population of 11.5 million people, a country that had virtually no standing army in 1939, produce the single division that penetrated the Atlantic Wall deeper than any other Allied force? The answer is not courage. Courage was everywhere that morning. The Americans at Omaha had courage. The British at Sword had courage. The answer is industrial. Between 1939 and 1945, Canada manufactured 815,729 military vehicles. Read that line again. 815,729. Trucks, armored cars, gun carriers, universal carriers, tanks. Canadian truck production alone exceeded the total military truck production of Germany. The British official history of the war called soft skin transport Canada's single most important contribution to Allied victory, because an army that cannot move its ammunition, its fuel, and its wounded forward is not an army. It is a position waiting to be overrun. That number, 815,729 vehicles, is why the system worked. It is why 14,000 Canadians could land with enough armor, enough transport, enough engineering equipment, and enough ammunition depth to keep moving inland when other forces stalled at the waterline. But the vehicles were only part of it. Under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, Canada hosted over 107 flying schools across the prairies and graduated 131,553 aircrew between 1940 and 1945. President Roosevelt called Canada the aerodrome of democracy. The Royal Canadian Navy grew from 13 ships and 3,500 personnel in 1939 to the third largest navy in the world by 1945. Roughly 434 commissioned warships, 95,000 men and women in uniform. The Reich could not replicate this. Germany's industrial base was under around-the-clock strategic bombing by mid-1944. Its oil production was collapsing. Its trained aircrew were being lost faster than replacements could be found. The Canadian system was not cleverer than the German system. It was wider, it was deeper, and it was built on a continent the Luftwaffe could never reach. If your father, grandfather, or great-uncle served with the 3rd Canadian Division, or the 1st Hussars, or the Queen's Own Rifles, or any of the regiments that landed at Juno on June 6th, I would be grateful to hear their name and unit in the comments. These stories are how the memory survives. Part 4. By midday on June 6th, the picture forming at German 84th Corps headquarters was not the picture General Marks had expected. The 716th Division was being destroyed as a fighting force. In a post-war interview with the United States Army Military History Institute, General Richter said plainly that his division had been defeated and badly beaten up in Normandy. By June 15th, the formation had lost 60% of its soldiers. 80% of its artillery was gone by the evening of the 6th. In that same interview, Richter conceded that the Allied assault's inter-service coordination had been built on many years of preliminary practice, something his static garrison had never faced and had no framework to counter. They were right that concrete multiplied defensive firepower. They were right that the tide and the obstacles would exact a toll. What they were wrong about was the assumption that the force hitting the beach would fight the way forces had always fought against a fortified coastline with infantry unsupported and armor unable to land. The The only armored counterattack of the entire day came from the 21st Panzer Division. Its commander, General Edgar Feuchtinger, had been absent from his headquarters that morning. The response was fatally delayed. Elements of the division drove into the 3-kilometer gap between Juno and Sword Beaches late in the afternoon, reaching the coast near Bernières-sur-Mer around 2000 hours. But Allied naval gunfire, airstrikes, and anti-tank fire halted the advance. And when a massive formation of Allied gliders swept overhead that evening, the German armor pulled back. The counterattack that was supposed to drive the invasion into the sea never materialized. And while the panzers stalled, something extraordinary was happening further south on the Canadian axis. Lieutenant Bill McCormick of C Squadron, 1st Hussars, 6th Armored Regiment, had lost contact with the infantry in the confusion of the afternoon advance. Rather than halt, his tank troop pressed on. They drove through Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse, pronounced Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse, and kept going south. They crossed the Caen to Bayeux railway line. That railway was the divisional final objective. It was codenamed Oak. No other Allied unit on any of the 5 beaches reached its assigned final D-Day objective on June 6, 1944. McCormick's troop did. They were not supposed to get this far. Without infantry to consolidate the ground, McCormick pulled his tanks back. The regimental history records with dry Canadian understatement that the venture prompted humorous accusations that Bill had planned a dash to Paris. But the fact remained. A troop of Canadian Shermans had driven deeper into occupied France than any Allied formation that day and touched the one line the entire invasion plan said they should reach. Part 5. So here is the answer to the question in the title of this video. The German High Command could not explain how the Canadians got furthest inland on D-Day because they were asking the wrong question. They were asking how a static division behind concrete had failed to hold a beach. The real question was how a country of 11.5 million people had spent 4 years building an industrial, naval, and air training system that could project more combat power per division onto a hostile shore than any other force in the Allied order of battle. The Germans had concrete, the Canadians had depth, the Germans had a wall, the Canadians had a system. I should be honest about what the Canadians did not achieve. They did not take Carpiquet Airfield, their ultimate objective for the day. They fell roughly 7 kilometers short. That airfield would not fall for another month. And in the days that followed, the fighting around Caen would exact a bitter price on the Canadian battalions. The cost of Normandy was far from over on the evening of the 6th. But on that single day, 14,000 Canadians from a nation the world had mostly overlooked landed on a fortified beach, broke through its defenses, and drove deeper into France than any Allied force. The Hauptmann I described at the opening of this video is a composite. I should tell you that. He is a stand-in for several German officers of the 716th Division whose reports and post-war interviews I drew from. The confusion he felt was real. The wall he trusted was real. The men who broke through it were real. Their names were Charlie Martin, Philip Gower, Bill McCormick, and roughly 14,000 others whose names should not be allowed to disappear. They were not supposed to get this far. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More beaches, more campaigns, more regiments, more men who were forgotten and who deserve better than forgetting.